Okay, we are live, MythVision podcast. Welcome back. This is my second interview I've ever had the opportunity of doing with Dr. Shady Nasser. Dr. Nasser has written several books. I'm going to share my screen here in just a second. But Dr. Nasser, since our first time discussing, if you don't mind, what is your expertise? What is your background? And what about these books here that you've written?
Okay, Derek. So nice to see you again. I mostly work on, as you can see here, the variant readings of the Quran, the transmission of the Quran, so how it was transmitted, its different reading traditions, and its reception among Muslims over the centuries. This, of course, entails working with Arabic grammar, early Arabic poetry, etc. So mostly I work on the transmission of the text and its reception. This is the first book that I wrote, transmission of the variant readings. The second book is on the canonization of the Quran. The third book that I'm finishing right now is on the different reading traditions and its relationship to Arabic grammar and poetry.
And as far as your education goes, I know you're teaching at Harvard, and I was hoping at some point to meet you in person in Harvard, and we could do some discussion.
You're always welcome. So whenever you have time, you're always welcome to come. Yeah.
Well, we'll make that happen at some point for sure, because I enjoy learning from all of you. And so your specialty obviously focuses on the canonization, but also you know the language. So I figure you, especially compared to me, are in a position to know on this subject far greater than I do. And I want to learn from you today, and I want our audience also to tune in. So you can go in the description, just in case anyone watching, get a copy of his books if you're really interested in a deep dive, because it's going to be names and words that you're not used to. This has been something I had trouble with first getting into Islam, and still to this day, into Islamic studies, the Quran. There's lots of names and things I'm not familiar with. So you have to get used to knowing who people are, Googling. And once you start mapping out names, especially major players, it starts to make better sense. So can you tell us what the Islamic narrative is on the origins of the Quran, the faith-based side, we'll call it, and to the canonization? And then I'd like to do some thought experiments with you using historical methodology, putting faith to the side, and we'll discuss different ideas.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I think the first thing to discuss is when we talk about the origins of any book, right? So usually in Western scholarship, when you talk about the Bible or any work, you need manuscripts, right? So you say, well, how did I receive this book? I have this book. Where's the manuscript from? Okay, this is how it was published. And we are accustomed to having different manuscripts. We compare these manuscripts. We know what's the parent manuscript and where it was copied from. We are lucky if we find a manuscript that was written by the author himself. This is the Holy Grail in a sense. Now, in the case of the Quran, it's a little bit different. Of course, we do have early manuscripts, not necessarily complete, but the case of the Quran is a little bit different because you have this kind of combination between written transmission, these manuscripts, and oral transmission, or aural, A-U-R-A-L, rather than oral, in a sense, is that Muslims memorize the text since its inception, okay? So let's go with the traditional narrative, is that the Prophet Muhammad, he received revelation from God through the angel Gabriel, which is the Quran, right? So he received these revelations, and then over 20 years, 22 years, or 23 years, these several revelations came to be known as the Quran, as the text that we have right now. Now, the important thing to know is most Muslim scholars agree that the Quran was not collected. So this book that you buy now, the Quran, from the bookshop or you get it from wherever, it was not collected in the same manner or in the same shape when Muhammad died. Okay, so this is when we get to the transmission of the text. So how did we get this copy? So the Muslim narrative says that when Muhammad died, Muslims, his companions, they memorized the text. Some of them memorized more than other people. Okay.
And may I interject as we go?
Sure,
Just
please go ahead anytime. So sometimes I say things I think that they are taking for granted, and you can please come in and let me know to explain things.
Well, I just want to make sure and get your clarification. This means at this moment, according to the Muslim narrative, there is no text of the Quran. There's no book. There's no canonization. But is it all in memory, or is it also like in various places, like you've said before, like on leaves and stones?
Yeah, so that's the issue, is that there are different narrations of how it was recorded. So the interesting thing about when we talk about Islamic narratives is that you don't have one narrative. So they always, the danger is when you go to one narrative or two narratives and say, well, these two narratives are representative of what happened in Islam. The more sources you consult, the more narratives you find, which may contradict each other or complement each other. So in this early period, you have several narratives, how the Quran was recorded. So some narratives suggest that Muhammad did have a collection, that he was instructing his scribes to write chapters of the Quran and rearrange them. So this suggests that there was writing at a certain point. He had scribes, official scribes, named in the sources, that whenever he received revelation, he would instruct them to go and write what he received on parchment or certain writing material that they had during that time. There are many narratives in non-standard, if you want, Islamic sources, that certain companions of Muhammad, they used to also write certain revelations, and they had not necessarily a book but sheets, and they would write it down and memorize it. If you want, the tradition of memory and memorizing poetry and Quran, and the Quran is poetic in a sense, so it's not poetry as standard poetry, but it is poetic. It rhymes, it follows certain metrical forms, but it is a poetic text that people memorized it, and people memorize it until today. So you would find now an 7-8-year-old kid who memorized the whole Quran. It's not unusual. So there are these all different forms of documentation, whether it's memory or primitive documentation of the Quran on parchment, on leaves, maybe some inscriptions, different types of documentations, but not a book.
Okay, so there's no book. We have two questions.
Yeah.
And the first one is related to this, and another one I kind of want to take you back before we move forward. The first one I want to get is this idea. What is the earliest date of this narrative saying, hey, these are written on rocks and leaves and on sheets and things? What is the earliest voice that we have that's saying these things that we're aware of, if you can remember?
So when we talk about the Islamic narratives, we talk about something called accounts, was a hadith, right? Narrations.
Right.
And these narrations, they follow what is called a chain of transmission. Okay, a chain of transmission, meaning that I can say, for example, you tell me something, you tell me a story right now. So if I'm talking to my friend or to students, I would say that Derek told me something, right? So I'm reporting on your behalf. So, and then if this story that you told me, you heard it, let's say from, I don't know, your friend John, then when I talk to my friend or my students, I would tell them that John told Derek, okay, and Derek told me that. Okay, so now we have three people transmitting the same account. So, and this is how things are dated. Now, what happened is that you and I, we are in the same generation in a sense. So we are not a student-teacher relationship. So when you have a student-teacher relationship, then you can talk about generations. So if you have a chain of transmission with A transmitted from B, transmitted from C, from D, then you can say, well, you can date back this transmission to A and C and say, well, probably it is 60 or 70 years before, or 2 or 3 generations. Now, the problematic nature of Islamic sources is that they are always dated later. So we don't have early documentation of what was happening during the time of the Prophet and his companions, or even the first 100 years, let's say. So this is what we call the formative period of Islam. We don't have direct documentation from that period. All what we know about this period was transmitted later on from eyewitnesses. So from the Islamic point of view, you have faith and trust in this chain of transmission. Okay, I trust you.
I just want to point out, this is the same faith and trust kind of thing, not identical, but that we see in the early church with patristics going back to apostles. And then one more comment on something before, because we're already getting ahead, and I like this, but is I think of in Second Temple Judaism, you have these revealer type themes in the literature. Even what I would think are competing Judaisms. And what we have is like Enochian Judaism and Mosaic Judaism. And you find even in the Enochian Judaism, there's 5, kind of like a Torah of Enoch perspective, where he's a revelator who's revealed this heavenly knowledge. Do you think, and this might get into esoteric weeds, because I know that a lot of Muslims will think Gabriel revealed to Muhammad literally in some literal way. There's no way to know what is ultimately meant here. But I'm looking back and saying, okay, who got the divine laws? Moses. Okay. He gets these laws that I see in several other ancient Near Eastern cultures. I also find stuff that in Plato, but that's a different topic. My point is I'm looking at it and I go, I don't need to say that Moses really actually got this stuff from heaven, because you know my perspective. I come from a different angle. But do you think that the narrative is more theological and it got literalized over time by Muslims, instead of just saying, hey, he's our divine lawgiver, he's the one who's been revealed these things, kind of like what we've done with Moses or Enoch? What is your personal perspective as a scholar evaluating that original narration that the Quran is given through Gabriel, or the archangel Gabriel to Muhammad?
So I think I would. I mean, I can't speak. I can't speak on behalf of all scholars, but I think there is a common understanding, and I think I mentioned that maybe with you or with someone else, is that usually in university settings or in academic settings, there are certain items of faith that you really don't need to discuss or say, well, oh, did Muhammad receive revelation or not? We have to prove or disprove that. Okay, meaning that what we are more interested in is that the situation or the circumstances within which Muhammad received his revelation. Now, whether as a believer you believe that he received the revelation from God through Gabriel, or he composed the text of the Quran, okay, that's you can't solve this.
Let me ask you, well, in that vein, what is the earliest account that we have of that, of the narration of this like revelation? And I guess it could be later. I don't know if this is first in the Hadith that's like really emphasizing it. But I guess what I'm saying is by this time, look at the church. I'm only being able to go at analogous. I have to analogize to Christianity because I don't have any, personally, I don't know much about the Persian, contemporaneous Persian ideas that were floating around on the level. But I'm looking at the Christian church, and I know that hundreds of years later, they theologize, they allegorize, they do things. And I kind of wonder if this narration's more theological.
I mean, it is. These narrations are definitely theological. They are not only historical. Right, so they are not really describing the situation of what was happening to Muhammad and his companions. I mean, you have to understand again, within our investigation of what was happening in 7th century Arabia, the situation of early Muslims was not separate from what was happening to Christians and Jews. So they knew what was happening in the church. You know, these things are mentioned in the Quran. People. The whole narrative of the revelation of the Quran and circumstances, it's almost, I think even from the Islamic perspective, that it is a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. You can't separate how Islam was formed from the situation of Christianity and Judaism. It's impossible. Now you have of course, certain groups of Muslims, they want to say, well, it doesn't matter what was happening to Christianity and Judaism. Muhammad received the revelation, and he was not aware of what was happening to his surroundings or circumstances. And this is the power or the miracle of revelation. But historians look at these things differently, right? So Muhammad was a merchant. He was in touch with Christians in the north. He was in touch with the Christians in the south. They knew what was happening in Ethiopia, the Christians there. They were in touch with the Jews in Medina, in Hijaz. So Islam was born in a context of late antiquity. Islam, as an early civilization, it's almost a sponge, right? That absorb different traditions from Christianity, from Judaism, from Persia, from Manichaeans, name it. It's not right. a religion or a culture or a civilization that was born out of nothing, right? So this is what I think usually in our in university settings, what we teach is that how Islam was born in late antiquity. It is situated in that context. So of course, what was happening in the church is important. Of course, what was happening in Judaism is important. Of course, what was happening in commercial trade routes and early scriptures is important. It's not born out of nothing, out of vacuum.
So just, I guess the point, and I want to go back to your giving us the story, that the earliest accounts of this revelation and how the Quran came to Muhammad, is that first seen in the Hadith much later?
So, I mean, we could say it's there's no specific date, but we can say that the earliest sources that we have about these narratives of revelation, if you want to date them in that sense, I say like 2nd century, the beginnings of 2nd century Islamic calendar. So that would basically be 8th century.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
So 8th century, in a sense that you really have these seeds, documentation. I'm talking about documentation, that you would have early books that have these narratives concerning these incidents of revelation. 8th century, maybe a little bit later.
And you're suggesting back to our oral transmission that there seems to be, when they actually put pen to paper, already existing oral tradition that, hey, we got this stuff back here.
Correct.
And in your estimation, as a, I like to consider you a critical scholar, historical scholar. In your estimation, is there good reason to accept some of this and to say maybe there's some really good, valid historical reality to some of the material that we have, even if it has been a few centuries? What is your personal take on how do we sift through this to know what is trustworthy and not trustworthy?
So this is the crux of the matter in critical scholarship. You have, and this is the beauty of it, is that you have different scholars with different opinions. Okay, so you have people who you have scholars. And this is what we study, right, in universities, that you have scholars who completely want to disregard Muslim sources because they are biased, right? And they want to consult non-Muslim sources, what was happening in Arabia. And I do not want to consult hadith literature because they are forged or fabricated or they were written later on. And I want to consult what was happening, Aramaic sources, the sources in Syriac, Latin, Greek, that tell us about Arabia. So you have this one approach. You have the other approach, which is trusting Muslim sources, that these people were in touch with their civilization. They are writing their own history, okay? And more or less, you have to trust what was happening, especially if there are narratives that are widely reported in the sources. So if you have certain narratives about the revelation or what was happening to Muhammad, and they are reported over and over in several sources, now yes, you could have some doubts, but you don't have to suspect that everything was fabricated and everything was a conspiracy theory in a sense, especially if they are widely reported in the sources.
I find the same problem in early Christian studies with critical scholars, because some say, let's play a game going back and forth between New Testament and what we're finding here. Some people go, nothing in the New Testament should be trusted. I mean, even on a historical level, there's some people who doubt Jesus existed, right?
Right.
And then you have some on the other end who are like, everything that's said in it, fundamentalist, if you will, who say everything in it happened as it said. He walked on the water. He did the whole nine. Most of the scholars that I talk to fall somewhere in the middle spectrum between there's historical stuff, but it's highly theological, symbolized, metaphors, different things like that. And even sometimes they put words into the mouth of Jesus. I imagine Hadith do this for Muhammad.
Same thing.
So then the real question becomes, how do we know, or how can we be confident? Is it just a faith and trust in the tradition? Or do we say, hey, there's some historical stuff out here. It isn't, I'm going to bring miracles into this for 1 second, because most scholars, even if they believe, know that historical methodology doesn't put the miracle on the table as something that they really factor in. But when you start reading stuff that seems more fantastic or theology type stuff, looks more like literature and not actual history, that stuff would start to make me go, okay, that didn't happen. Is this the same tools that we're doing in Christianity that they're trying to use over here with the Hadith and early Muslim sources and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, see, this is why usually Western scholars, they are skeptic, right? Because so they tell you, oh, come on, I'm not going to trust historical narratives that Muhammad split the moon, or you know, he healed or cured a person who was dying. These are all tales that are definitely go against reason and against science. So if these narratives are fabricated, then everything must be fabricated. And you know, I'm generalizing, but if you have the same person, you have the same historical figure who transmitted two narrations for you. One narration telling you that Muhammad split the moon, okay, which as a person of science or believing in rational matters, you would say, well, this is a matter of mythology or a folktale, that it didn't happen.
Right.
And the same person, the same historical figure, transmitted a historical narration, okay, that has nothing to do with mythology, that Muhammad participated in a battle and he did this and he did that. So the Western scholar would be skeptic. It's the same figure the same historian who transmitted these two narratives. And for sure, I'm going to dismiss A because it's definitely didn't happen. The moon was not split, or Muhammad did not perform miracles because he's not a believer. Then I should dismiss B as well.
Got it.
You see? And this is why many historians, Western historians, they reject Hadith, these traditions, as historical sources.
And so I guess
there are many problems with them.
What would you, as someone who sees those scholars, I'm sure you sit back and see all of it and think, because I've heard you on your previous interview with Dr. Reynolds, wonderful interview. I put that in the description so people can go watch it. It sounds to me that you are more, and correct me, I want you to put where you are on this, and then I want us to continue the narration of canonization and stuff. But it sounds to me that you're more someone in the middle. We talked about the New Testament. You're not going to either extreme. But would you say that you trust the Islamic narrative at least more than some of the Western scholars that you are affiliated with?
I wouldn't say, it's not a matter of which sources you trust or Western. When we say Western scholarship,
right?
There are also different trends, right, in Western scholarship. But you have this kind of extreme Western scholarship, which is, you know, revisionist in a sense, that we don't trust Muslim sources, not because they have anything against Muslim sources. It's a matter of being skeptic about everything and starting from scratch, right? And the problem with the revisionist trend is that it's very anemic. Okay, you always rely on sources outside the people who wrote their own history. And my position, as I think, you know, many people, is, as you said, it's in the middle. So the Muslim sources, again, there isn't just one book or one source in Muslim source. It's not only Bukhari. as I mentioned, it's like everything in this book that you have to trust. When you are studying Islamic history, there are so many different sources and so many different opinions. And the beauty of it is that you have different opinions and different ways of describing things. It's not just only it happened this way, right? And the reason why I tend to have some trust or some faith in, let's say, the core of the Islamic narrative is that because there are many different sources reporting the same event, and all these sources, they don't belong to the same opinion. So they actually disagree with each other in terms of theology or politics, but they are reporting the same event.
So
right?
even
so
enemies...
you have two people with different political and theological views reporting the same event.
Okay.
And then you would say both of them are reporting the same event, even though they have disagreements. So you start having, okay, this event is reported over and over and over. And also you have so many sub-events related to that event that are also reported in the sources. The more sources you consult, published and unpublished, the more you see that you can some kind connect the threads together. Not necessarily make a wholesome, new narrative, but that there's some truth to what was happening. So in Western scholarship, I think I mentioned that with Gabriel the other day, we have been, I will use the same word, plagued by almost 2 decades of scholarship doubting that the Quran was collected very late. It wasn't collected in the 7th century. It was collected 100 years later or 150 years later. Why? Because Western scholars need manuscripts. You need physical evidence.
Right.
And of course, there was a push even from other Western scholars. They didn't buy into this whole narrative that the Quran was collected. There are many Western scholars who were not Muslims. They also said, no, we don't have to go with Wansbrough and the other revisionist ideas that the Quran was collected 150 years later or 100 years later. Why do we have to? I mean, we have so many early Muslim sources that talk about the Quran being collected early. And suddenly we find early manuscripts or early fragments of the Quran. And then Muslim scholars, oh, okay, we were wrong. Yes, the Quran probably might have been collected early. So, right, reinventing the wheel in a sense. Same with pre-Islamic poetry. Now we have so many people, oh, pre-Islamic poetry is all fabricated. It's all made up post-Islam. Suddenly we find an inscription that dates back to the 2nd century, okay, AD. And then people, oh, okay, now we can trust pre-Islamic poetry or a core of pre-Islamic poetry. So I'm saying that always in Western scholarship, they always need physical evidence, because they don't trust Muslim sources, not because they have something against Muslim sources, because it's not their tradition, and it's understandable. So my position is always be in the middle, okay, mitigate in a sense, not trust everything on the right, not trust everything on the left, try to see the different opinions of both sides and go with that. So my own perspective is that I think there's value in people's scholarship, whether they are revisionist or not. I teach in my classes Wansbrough and Michael Cook, the early Michael Cook, and all the revisionist views. We discuss them in class, and then there's something to learn from that. But always, I think being in the middle is, from my perspective, is the best. Not too far to the right, not too far to the left. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so continuing into this narrative that you're kind of painting here on how the Quran came to be standardized or canonized under Uthman. And there's multiple canonizations. Eventually, your second book goes on to talk about the 7 ahrufs.
Yes, 7 reading or 7 modes or ahruf. Yes.
But specifically, can you tell us what that is? And do you, by any chance, differ from the Islamic narrative on any of these respects? Or do you have any particular quarrels about the narrative that you've heard from the sources? I'm going to start saying it plural since you've corrected me. I used to just say the Muslim source. It's like, no, the sources in Islamic narratives. Do you happen to have anything in those narratives that you disagree with on how things really went down?
Yeah, so thank you for saying sources. It's important to emphasize that we do have several trends and several sources when we talk about Islamic history, and it's not only one source or one narrative. The issue with the canonizations or different strands of standardization of the Quran, it's a matter of theology rather than really a matter of history. From our perspective, it's a matter of history, right? As far as I am concerned, I have this book, and I want to know how we received this book. Is this book called the Quran that we are reading today? Is it the same? Is it exactly the same book as it was 1400 years ago? Right? From a Muslim theological perspective, they would tell you, yes, it has to be the same book, right? That's the believer perspective. The same Quran that was revealed to Muhammad through Gabriel, that the way that he was reciting it, it did not change. It's exactly the same. Hundreds and thousands of Muslims memorized it, and they memorized it until today, and it's exactly the same. This is one perspective from Muslim sources. There are also other perspectives within Islam that they tell you a different story, right? They don't necessarily tell you that, oh, the Quran we are reading today is different from the Quran that Muhammad was reading, okay? But different sources tell you a different story of how the Quran was collected and what do we mean by this 7 ahruf or 7 modes of recitation. Meaning that, how did we receive the text that we have today? Okay, we have to go back to something called the Cairo edition, let's say, 1923, 1924, the way it was voweled, right? Or the way, you put diacritics. Okay, so before 1923, 1924, what was happening before? What did Muslims read, right? In Pakistan and in Egypt? Well, they were, of course, memorizing it, but they were also reading it from manuscripts or from printed editions. And then, okay, you can trace that back to, let's say, around the year 1400, 1420 something, where people were reading the Quran according to a certain system of recitation. So a reading with capital R is a system of recitation, okay? So you have, like in Hebrew, right? So you have a consonantal outline without dots and diacritics to tell you how to vowel the text. The same in Arabic. If you vowel the text differently, then you would have a different system of recitation. And these different systems of recitation, it took time to develop. And when I talk about canonizations, I'm trying to trace out how these different systems of recitation were developed over time, and until when you can trace them in time. And what you notice is that, if you want, I can talk in detail about that, but very briefly, is that over these 1400 years, Muslims in different regions in the world, they were reciting the Quran according to different systems, right? And what was happening during the time of the Prophet and his companions, that they were also reciting different systems. There were systems of recitation that came, they were more popular than other systems of recitation for one reason or another. We can discuss them later. Other systems, they went extinct. Okay? So there were companions of Muhammad who were reciting the Quran differently from the Quran that we have today.
Do you think it's fair to say, and I know I'm throwing this out there to you because you might know, do you think that some of the recitation that the Prophet and his companions would have recited the Quran on, are there any points of that have gone extinct that you think might?
No, for sure. Many of the recitations that probably, the Prophet and his companions, they were reciting, we can be sure that we don't have everything, right? It's not a matter of maybe. It's definitely we have what we received a lot of information. So Muslim scholars, they preserved a lot of information about these variant readings, the non-canonical readings, apocryphal, if you want to use the Christian term for that. We have codices which do not conform, but they are a little bit different in that regard. So even the non-canonical readings, more or less, they are very similar to what you have now. There are additions and omissions of verses, of words. So it's not really a drastic, let's say, revision or different edition. You have, the Gospel of Mark, and then you have Luke. They are a little bit different. It's a different story. So you do have omissions, additions of words, rearrangement of verses of these non-canonical codices or non-canonical readings. But I wouldn't describe them as really like version A and version B. Okay, so they are very similar, more or less. Okay, to the trained person, I would say they are different. To someone who's not trained, they could be similar. I don't know if it's a fair assessment. So if you are initiated and you can read Arabic and you have both, and you can read Arabic and you know the Quran, it's very obvious that they are different. But if you are average educated and you really, you only know, I don't know, a few lines of the Quran for your prayers, and you look at both, they are very similar to you and you can't detect. It's like reading, I don't know, 2 sonnets for Shakespeare, or reading Chaucer. Let's say you have an average educated American reading Chaucer, they can barely, I don't know, read the letters. But then if you have someone who's English literature major, probably they could tell the difference between Old English or different poems, something along those lines.
You, in your last interview with Dr. Reynolds, you and him briefly mentioned in passing, didn't dwell on it, and I don't really want to dwell on it either because I think it's a given, and that is that the canonization, or even the way that scripture preservation, canonization, all of that by Christians and Jews would have influenced them out the gate. So they already would have had, from the start of this, or very early on at least, let's preserve, and we need to preserve based on their probably brushing shoulders with monks and Christians in the region and Jews, and they understand the tradition. Like you said, there's a continuity. But my question to you is this, and this is putting like the faith Islamic narrative kind of aside for a second, in your opinion, do you think like evidence like the palimpsest, manuscript, that might be evidence? Or do you think that there's evidence that the standardization process from Uthman may have kind of constructed some of this stuff, and it may not actually all go back to the prophet? My point is like before this standardization, kind of like the palimpsest had stuff written over it,
right?
And we discovered there was something that was a little different, not completely different, but there's differences.
Different, sure.
You think we lost some of the original meanings to some of the stuff that we see?
Right.
Taking a historical approach, I understand the faith position. I'm saying let's set that to the side.
Yeah.
Using your academic estimation, what is your thoughts?
So 2 things here. First, even within, when we talk about Islamic sources, so you have this, I don't want to call it extreme, let's say faith-oriented perspective, is that the Quran is unchanged, or this is one narrative. But again, I want to emphasize that Islamic sources, when you read the Islamic historical narratives about what was happening, it's not surprising. Finding a palimpsest or finding a non-canonical reading, you already have that in the sources, right? So not all is, so if you only read, again, re-emphasize, if you are only reading one source or one perspective from Islamic sources, that this is the Quran and we don't trust the palimpsest and we don't expect to find a palimpsest, of course people will be shocked.
It's anachronistic.
We found a palimpsest. We found a Quran which is against what we are reading today, because people are only reading, or they're only hearing, one source. But if you consult other sources and other historical narratives, you are not shocked or surprised.
Can I give an example?
Right?
Can I give an example that I think is going to be good?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Look at Christian canon. Okay, we have 27 New Testament books. When you start talking about the Acts of Peter or some other non-canonical text, people get really sensitive that are in the tradition, because they have a canon and an established thing. Is this another analogy of saying that maybe before the development that happened over the first few centuries, there were several readings and ideas and traditions and stuff that may have gone back? So of course there were different things than what we find in just the Quran. And over time, that standardization kind of framed a solid what Muslims must think about their tradition, must think about their book. And that's not how it was. It was more malleable early on. There was more flexibility and things like that. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that, and this is what it is. It's not, this is how it is. When always the late Orthodox position reorients the early sources. Okay, so you have to depend on the early sources. And when early sources are telling you something which is against the late Orthodox position, they try to reinterpret that, or they try to reorient that. So, we found there is a non-canonical reading, or a reading that goes against the Quran today. Oh, well, this must be a comment or an exegetical Quran. It's not really a Quran. Or this was abrogated. Okay, this is supersession. And there are so many, again, refutations and argumentations of late Orthodox positions arguing against early Muslim authorities. So forget about Western scholarship now. You have late Muslims arguing and refuting early Muslims why they are saying this and that about the Quran, right? So you have a very famous scholar called the Tabari. He's a famous exegete, one of the most influential early commentators of the Quran. And this is 9th century, let's say, so 936, 937 AD. And him and this generation, they were clearly rejecting certain readings of the Quran. So this reading is wrong. We don't agree with this reading. This must be false. This is grammatically incorrect. This position completely disappears later on. There's nothing grammatically wrong in the Quran. Everything in the Quran is perfect. Everything in the Quran is correct. So, and then late Muslim scholars argue against these early scholars that they were wrong or they didn't get it right? So it's always reorienting the old material or the transmitted material to serve the new Orthodox position of
Is that
what the Quran should be.
Your second book, that's pretty much, I'm sure you get into a lot of that in the canonization.
So when I talk about the canonization, and then we say, well, am I disagreeing with Muslim sources? No, because if you consult early Muslim sources and how they dealt with the Quran and how they tried to standardize the Quran, it's all basically derived from early Muslim sources and how they understood this process. So again, canonization of the Quran as what were the steps taken? First step, second step, third step, fourth step, until we reached the Quran that we have today. And that's what
when did we reach
when
did we reach the Quran we have today, as far as you can tell?
I mean, it's a tricky question in a sense that because when you talk about the Quran today, it includes recitational style, every single diacritic, every single vowel. It's a little bit difficult, but I would say, like, probably the way that you have all the diacritics right now, I would say maybe a couple hundred years, when all the punctuation and all the new printing, if you want, methods with the calligraphy, with the new dotting system, with when to pause, when to resume a recitation, all these technical details, these were all added recently, right? And if you want, propagated among Muslims. But the text as is, the text that you have as is, it's a stable text, okay? So forget about the diacritics and the vowels. So you could say easily, let's say 1,000 years ago, 1,100 years ago, the text of the Quran is stable. It's as is. You're not going to find really a manuscript that completely deviate from what you have right now. Yes, there are manuscripts we found in libraries and fragments that sometimes there's a word which is different. It goes back to a non-canonical reading. There's a misspelling here and there. There's a typo or a mistake. Yes, you find that often, not rarely. But the bulk of the text of the Quran is stable for the past 1,100 years, 1,200 years. Voweling, and this is so when I talk about canonization, is how you vowel the text and how many systems of recitation you accept. So first stage, there were many different systems of recitations allowed and many different voweling systems. And slightly they start to dwindle. So you get from 75 systems to 50 to 30 to 14 to 10 or 7. And now the accepted are 7 or 10 systems. But early on, you had more than 10 systems allowed. And again, these systems, sometimes they disagree only with manners of pronunciation, and sometimes with different voweling that could affect the meaning. So it could go either way.
One more point, and I want to get your opinion on it. And then we got some questions if you're
Sure, yeah.
open. And that is, I don't know the language. My good friend Marijn would know far better than me.
Sure.
And I think, he says the dialect in which the Quran, Uthmanic Quran we have, really comes back to like the Qurayshi tribe. And it seems like it may be a local, like you could almost say, hey, this really does go back to that tribe, which Muhammad would have come from. But the language itself, from what I understand, even Arabic, is changing over those few centuries. So to give more accurate, like there's gonna be changes as time goes by, because the language itself is kind of going through a change.
Changing, yeah. So very quickly on that. So you have also different positions on development of Arabic language. So you have a position that it goes back to, as early as, someone, Karl Follers, he wrote a book on that 100 years, as I think published 1896 or something, on the vernacular language of the Quran. And he argued that the Quran was revealed in vernacular Arabic, not the standard Arabic right now. It was revealed in the Quraysh vernacular Arabic. And then later on, grammarians standardized this vernacular Arabic and made it into the Arabic that we have right now. Okay, so this is a position in, among scholars in the development of Arabic, and they rely on different sources, manuscripts, and they argue for that. You have other position that they say, well, yeah, of course Arabic developed over time, but it wasn't that drastic. You don't have this kind of diglossia between vernacular and literary register, and they were very close. So again, it's not a finalized opinion in a sense that the consensus of scholars is this or that. You have people who believe in an early vernacular form of Arabic and diglossic Arabic as we have today. And there are scholars who say, no, you did have some vernacular, but the Quran, the Quran was revealed in a literary register and not in a vernacular register. So again, different opinions, no consensus on that. And it's good to read everyone's opinion on that and learn. So
and that's what I'm trying to do. And since we last talked 2 years ago, I didn't know anything. And I still, compared to any scholar in Islamic studies and stuff, I know very little.
No,
but
you
know
a lot. So this is very good. I'm glad
we're learning. I'm hoping my audience is picking up this as well, because I think it's interesting. I love studying the Bible, understanding its origins, where characters and things come from, and I see so many overlaps in a way, like comparative stuff that you can look at.
And the traditions, it's very good to study these comparative aspects. When I read things in Christianity and Judaism, I say, oh wow, this is exactly like the Quran. You have a trend in Judaism where they say, oh, also the Bible, the Old Testament is the verbatim word of God, right? And you have the same position also in Islam. This is the verbatim word of God. So you have they are similar to the Near Eastern traditions, and of course they influence each other and they are affected by one another.
Thank you for taking all that time for me. I'm going to go ahead and get some super chats.
Sure.
And that helps us with our channel. So thank you for those who are showing love. Dr. Nasser, first one is Yeshua the King. Is the Arabic of the Quran unmatched? Is this more of a subjective kind of question in saying, how do you understand this question?
Well, I think he's probably asking, he or she is asking about probably with mind the inimitability of the text. So you have a trend in Islamic scholarship, or what Muslims usually often believe, is that the Arabic of the Quran is superior to other forms of Arabic, right? It's literary quality. No one can write similar Arabic like the Quran. Okay, so this question, again, I think it's very subjective. So if you come from the Muslim tradition, of course the answer would be the Quran of the Arabic is unmatched, because you believe that the Quran is revealed to the Prophet. If you are an objective scholar, you would say, of course, the Arabic of the Quran is literary. It's similar in its quality to pre-Islamic poetry and early Arabic poetry. Now, whether it's superior or not, I think I'm not sure if there is standard even in other languages. Can you say in English that Shakespeare is superior to, I don't know, to Chaucer, or is T.S. Eliot the best poet ever, or his poetry is better than Ezra Pound? I mean, so these things are from, again, if you are not ascribing to Islamic faith, of course you have to be objective about these things. The thing that I think people agree on is that the language of the Quran is literary. It's high register Arabic. There's no contention about that. Whether it's unmatched or not, it's, I think, left for people to decide.
Thank you so much. And Yeshua the King again says, MythVision, can you discuss between Shady Nasser and an Islamic scholar be held on this channel? And do you think we have 100% of what Muhammad received? So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So the discussion, like, you mean discussing with someone else, like as a debate, or?
I don't know if that's what they
I'm not into debates. So if this is the question, and if 100% of what Muhammad received, again, it's, I mean, how can we historically really be sure what person X, what person Y received or not? We are living in 2023, and then you watch different news channels, and you have the same piece of news that Fox News and CNN, they are reporting it differently. So how are we going to know what happened 1400 years ago, and what exactly this narrative say or not? So again, if you are ascribing to Islamic faith, of course, you would believe that what Muhammad received is 100% what you have right now. But again, what do we mean by 100%? We know that, I think I mentioned that last time on your channel, there's something called abrogation. There are verses that were abrogated from the Quran that you don't have in the Quran that we have right now. Probably there are. I don't want. You also have a trend in Islam, Shia Islam at least, that they also believe, not all the Shia, but some of them, that not everything that Muhammad received was reported in the Quran. So again, it's a political slash faith issue that they have different opinions on that, and you can never be sure that what he received is 100% what we have today or not.
Thank you. Heng Fa Shi, good to see you here. What can we glean from the Mingana Lewis palimpsest, especially regarding this idea of the Quran being perfectly preserved, or the tradition this was delivered to Muhammad by Gabriel? If you could tell by the questions, my audience is more like skeptical, or like, you know.
Sure, no problem. Yeah. I mean, whether this palimpsest or other palimpsest, I think I mentioned that earlier, so I don't have to repeat it again, is that if you consult what different sources in Islam tell you about the history of the Quran, you would not be surprised to find palimpsest or non-canonical readings that do not conform to the Uthmanic reading that we have today, right? So again, you will only be surprised when you are consulting only one trend or one opinion that tell you that, oh, this is what we have is exactly what we had 1400 years ago. However, if you consult other Islamic sources, they tell you a different story. They don't necessarily tell you that the Quran was missing, but they tell you a different story in the different steps or different ways that the Quran was collected. Okay, so again, consulting different trends, different opinions within the Islamic, if you want, milieu, is going to make you not surprised when you find this palimpsest or future palimpsest or a codex that is different from the Uthmanic codex. Only if you listen to one opinion, you will be surprised.
I want to make one comment on that I love what you said here. I was an evangelical Christian who was a fundamentalist for many years. I had this strict literalist understanding, kind of like what you're describing here. And I think if I was educated, I don't know where I'd be. I'd probably be where I'm at now. Eventually, you study your way to where you are. But if I had more flexibility and didn't like have this very tight bubble, that if I found evidence contrary to my narrative, pop everything, oh my gosh, my whole world collapsed.
Yeah.
That I feel like if they just studied more of their own stuff, they'd be a little less protective and dogmatic and things like that. And it allows them to be more mature in their approach so that.
And this is not your fault. This is the fault of the people who taught you, or again, in the case of some Muslims who believe that, oh, this is how it is. It's not their fault. It's the fault of the people who are instructing them, oh, this is how it is. And people should educate if they really care about their students, in a sense, to teach them what different sources say. And there are many Muslim countries or institutions that they are good at that. So if you talk to people from, I think, for example, again, from experience, Moroccan, let's say, or Egyptians, let's say, they have traditional institutions that they are more open about these things than other Islamic institutions in other countries. So they know about different, variant readings or non-canonic readings, that they are at ease about these things. And I was like, oh my God, this is, shocking to me. So there are certain institutions, Islamic institutions, that they are traditionally trained and they have different way of approaching these things. So again, not all Muslim institutions are the same in the way that they handle these issues and other issues as well.
Thank you. Yeshua the King's back. Muslims say Arabic grammar comes from the Quran. Granting that's true, is the grammar consistent even within itself, or does it violate its own rules?
Arabic grammar. So how you put the rules of grammar based on texts, right? So Arabic grammar doesn't exist as a software somewhere. So you need texts. And the text of in Arabic, it basically consists of the Quran and Arabic poetry. So Arabic exists before the Quran. Okay, Arabic grammar, the rules of Arabic grammar, they are not derived from the Quran. They are derived from early Arabic poetry and the speech of Arabs who used to be the native speakers of Arabic, and of course the Quran. Okay, so there are of course several verses in the Quran where they don't conform to the traditional classical Arabic grammar, okay? And there are many instances in pre-Islamic also Arabic poetry that they don't conform to the standard classical Arabic grammar. So Arabic grammarians want to set rules. They don't like exceptions, okay? In all languages, a grammarian wants to set the rules, and the language should be like a software. They disregard how people speak. They disregard dialects. It should be this way and that way. And the same with the Quran. So the Quran has many different reading traditions. These reading traditions vary. And sometimes there are many instances where grammarians try to find an exit, let's say, or a justification for a certain anomaly in the Quran by resorting to grammatical tools. So it is more or less, generally, the whole Quran is consistent with classical Arabic grammar. It's not necessarily because classical Arabic grammar was derived from the Quran. Right. So it is derived from the Quran, from the speech of early Arabs, eyewitnesses, if you want, or the Bedouin informants, as we call them, who used to speak more or less the same language, and pre-Islamic poetry. So it's not only the Quran, it's the Quran plus other sources.
And we have early inscriptions that predate the Quran.
And the problem with early inscriptions is that they are very short and they are not literary texts, right? So usually you'd have an inscription which is written on a tomb or, a few lines. It's very difficult to really construct grammar from these inscriptions, especially if, the philologists or archaeologists, they disagree on how to read these inscriptions, right? So you'd have one.
They disagree. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, there's the famous Namara inscription in Arabic. I like has 6 or 7 articles. Every scholar has his own reading of how to read the inscription and how to vowel it, right? So inscriptions are useful, but when it comes to grammar, to setting the rules for grammar, it's very difficult to rely on them 100%. Yeah.
Thank you. Doc Pluromana in the house. Good to see you again, my friend. Did the Uthmanic Mushafs match each other letter for letter? How do Muslim scholars explain that the 7 readings would need to match the 7 ahruf? Thinking of the spelling of, is it Maliki and Maliki?
Okay, so I'm not sure about the first part of the question. They match each other letter for letter. Okay. So first, there's the concept of ahruf, or seven ahruf. We don't know what ahruf means. Okay, so there are different interpretations within the tradition of what harf or ahruf mean. There is a misconception that the 7 ahruf equal the 7 readings, and that's a misconception. Okay, so 7 readings have nothing to do with the 7 ahruf. The 7 ahruf is basically trying to justify the existence of different readings. So you have very quickly 2 people of Muhammad's companions, they disagreed in reading a verse. They went to him. Person A told him, he told person A, recite. He recited, and he said, yes, it is correct. And Muhammad told the second person B, recite, and then he cited differently. And he said, yes, this is correct. Both of your readings are correct because the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf. It means modes, let's say. That's a industrial translation, right? The 7 readings, they came later on. The readings with a capital R, it's a system of recitation. So you are an eponymous reader, you are a reader, professional reciter. You have a system of recitation of the Quran from beginning to end, and you teach the system of recitation. It's different from person B. You are also an eponymous reader, and you have your own system of recitation. These 7 readings were collected later on out of many other systems of recitation that they could probably amount to 70 or 75, at least according to the, okay? So you have 7 ahruf, which is trying to justify the existence of variant readings of the Quran. Readings with capital R, they could be 7, they could be 10, they could be 14, they could be 50, they could be 70. So that's the difference. So there's no correspondence between the 7 and the 7. It's a misconception by Muslims also, by early Muslims who thought that the 7 ahruf are the 7 readings. Others clarified this, and there's really no correspondence between the two. Many people try to understand what is meant by 7 ahruf. There are many theories, and there's no consensus or agreement about that. Yeah,
I did an interview with Haitham Sidki on that.
Okay,
yeah, it was a really fun one, and he kind of goes into some of this, and I'm like, "Ooh, this is a deep rabbit hole."
Deep rabbit hole, yes. Yeah.
Imnag, thank you so much for the super sticker. I went back to see if I missed any comment from you, but really, thank you for showing the love to the family here at MythVision and help and support. I really appreciate that. John D says, can you give us a brief bio of Muhammad? Scholars generally think there is little we can know about Jesus. Is Muhammad similar?
Well, you can go to Google or Chat GPT and ask him about Muhammad. They would give you a better answer than me. Same, I think we touched upon that about sources. What we know about Muhammad is mostly from the biography, which we call Sirah, right? So Sirat ibn Hisham, which is a redaction of an earlier Sirah by Ibn Ishaq, and from the different hadith. So that's the one of the, I don't say trusted sources, but there are many also historical problems and many problems with the content of the Sirah. Okay, so again, we have to understand that this Sirah was written, and it's written by one trend or one political view of the biography, if you want, or the Sirah of Muhammad. There are many early scholars, especially non-Sunni. So this is a mainstream Sunni biography of Muhammad. Shi'i Muslims, they don't agree with the biography, and they have their own sources of the biography, that Muhammad is portrayed in this biography different from how he is portrayed in the Shia tradition, right? So again, it's a early biography. It's again a matter of faith or being a critical scholar, to what extent you trust this biography and its content. And even Muslim scholars, Sunni scholars, they have some problems with some of the content there regarding the authenticity of certain accounts there. Yeah.
One comment on this is that I mentioned before we went, I am good friends with Javad Hashmi, and he's at your institution. He came on after I did an interview with Reuven Firestone on the idea of jihad, and just kind of reconstructing Muhammad. Javad makes the point, like, these later biographies and authors that are kind of trying to reconstruct what they would do sometimes with the Quran is they'll have a verse, and then the next verse is like a completely different context, and it's like you're reading patches, like it's all just patches. And he's saying, but if you allow the context to continue, it actually helps him not look as violent as some of the biographers later tried to portray him as, just allowing the Quran itself to kind of be the voice of the prophet. If you grant that this goes back to Muhammad, makes him look less violent, less, I guess you'd say in our modern context, because we don't want a bad, we don't want him to be violent stuff, than what the biographers later portray him as. And so it's interesting.
Well, I mean, no. Again, it's a point of view. I usually I'm very careful with what is violent for us now. It's not necessarily violent 1400 years ago.
Exactly.
Okay, so for these biographers, it's either you believe that someone is intentionally trying to paint Muhammad as violent. If you really think that what is in the biography is violent, probably for them is not. And the way that if you grow up in a Muslim context, I'm not sure what they are teaching now, but I would say 30 or 40 years ago, I wouldn't say violent, I would say heroic. Right? So there's a big difference. So I don't think anyone 30 or 40 years ago, at least how you are studying the biography of Muhammad, he's not described as violent, he's described as a hero. So these are heroic deeds. So when you say, well, he participated in the battle himself and he was carrying a sword and he got injured, that's a heroic deed. He's not a coward. But then if you are afraid of all this modern, package of him being violent as a prophet, and then you try to basically improve his. So I would be careful of trying to say what is violent for you now is violent 1400 years ago.
I think
yes, maybe there are things that are, of course, common between us and the people 1400 years ago, but I think we have different standards that we have to be careful, not generalizing. What is good or bad for us is the same for these people back then.
I totally get it. I was raised in a military household, so my dad being Green Beret, Special Forces, all that.
Yeah.
But I think in the context, it was specifically about how to treat non-believers, because you know how a lot of people who want to disabuse Islam will say stuff like, "Oh, he just kill any non-believer," like they almost go full extreme all the way. And so that was, I think, the reaction that Javad is trying to do. Anyway. We need to get through these, and I don't want to keep you forever because I want you to say, hey, Derek wants to do an interview. I think I'll give him my time because I'm being generous and he's not going to abuse it.
No problem. So it's fine. I'm okay. Yeah.
Are you? I want to make sure you're okay. And
no problem. Yes. Yeah.
I apologize because
no, not at all. We are starting the semester now, so time is flexible. It's no problem. Yeah.
Well, it's been 2 years, and I'm so glad to have you back here. So thank you for answering John's super chat. Captain Dadpool in the house, and he's also, he was military. What does Dr. Shady think about the Quran's take on the crucifixion of Jesus being so similar to Gnostic sources? Was the prophet have been familiar with with the Gnostic sources?
So I don't want to talk much about that because it's similar to other topics in the sense of what is the relationship between what the Quran is actually saying versus what the commentary on the Quran is saying. Okay. And they are two different things. So the crucifixion of Jesus in the Quran, it's the text is ambiguous, let's say. Okay. It's ambiguous in a sense that it's not clear. It doesn't tell you exactly what happened. The commentators come and then they flesh that out and they tell you, well, Jesus was not crucified and there's someone else who crucified instead of him. And then the word that it was similar, right? Like this person, who was crucified, he looked like Jesus, but it was not Jesus. So all this baggage, it comes from the commentary, right? And then again, you have they have many different trends here. Do you want to only be Quran only person? I don't care about commentaries. I don't care about the tradition, and I'm only going to take the Quran as a document and read it as is, which is very problematic because the Quran is not a historical text. It's not a book where you can read it and then exactly, okay, this is what's happening. The language is very vague in the Quran, very vague in a sense. It's not Gnostic or symbolic, but it's not exact. The Quran is not a book of history or science in the same way that the Bible, it's a narrative where it goes, from A to B. Even in the Bible, you have people disagreeing on what words mean. And the Quran is even more. And this is where hadith and commentary steps in, trying to come up with a narrative that agrees with the theological, if you want, understanding of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? So again, here you have to take sides. Do you want to only take the Quran and interpret the Quran as you want, or you want to go to the commentary and trust that these early commentators had a better understanding of the Quran than people today, right? So you have a text which is 1400 years old. You have commentators who are very close to the text, to the time of its inception. They are familiar with the culture, with the language, and this is why Muslim scholars, it's a tradition. It goes from one person to another. So to come now to say, well, I have in 2023, I have a different understanding of the text based on my knowledge of Arabic, and you are 1400 years separate from that text, and you want to disregard the commentary tradition, I think there's a problem with that. And I'm sure in Christianity, you have the same issue, reading the Bible only without resorting to commentaries. I guess you would know better. So.
No, but this is a good point. And you're also not saying just by what the commentators are saying, but considering it is an important point.
Yes,
it's not take it and accept it just because they're closer, but also don't just, well, I only want the Quran and I don't care what anyone says about it. That's early. So I personally, I mean, seriously, I have no axe to grind here. If I want to understand something, I'm probably going to look at early commentators and see what they say amongst each other, against each other, and try to get, you know what I mean? Because I don't even know the language.
And that's what we do, and that's what also early and late Muslim scholars do. You have different commentaries. Commentaries have different opinions about certain things. They agree on things. So if you have all the commentators who are even theologically and politically disagreeing on things, and they agree, all of them, on certain interpretation of a verse, and then you come now in I don't know 1400 years later and you say, well, I don't care about these 100 commentators and these thousands of hadith, and I'm going to interpret the Quran because it fits my modern understanding of Islam. I think this is a little bit problematic. You are free to do that. I respect your opinion, but I think it's not going to go well, especially when we are dealing with this in an academic manner. So again, crucifixion of Jesus, it's either you go with the text without the commentaries, or you have to go with the commentaries. It's and of course consulting non-Islamic sources is important on that matter. So
thank you. Free Thinker, thank you for the super chat. Are there in the Quran verses that plagiarized from the Jewish Talmud?
I wouldn't use the term plagiarize, not because it's politically incorrect. I think traditions, they impact each other, including the Quran. So of course there are verses and chapters. I mean, I always teach chapter Joseph in my classes, and I always read with them the biblical Joseph, right? And if you compare both stories, there are verses that they are exactly the same. It's not, we don't call it in academic setting plagiarism,
right?
Because we don't think about a person who is sitting really and translating, from the Talmud or translating from other sources in that manner. So again, I repeat what I said in the beginning, that the Quran and Islam was not born from vacuum. It's influenced by the Jewish tradition, by Christian traditions, by other traditions that were happening at the same time. So it's only natural that you would find verses and chapters that they are similar to other traditions. Now, if you are a believer, you would say that this is revelation. If you are not a believer, you would think that Muhammad plagiarized this from other sources. But again, you have to also understand that he was not the only one. If Muhammad wrote the Quran as a non-believer, that there are other people who also knew what was happening, right? So when, for example, when in the Quran it addresses Muhammad and tells him, tell us about the story of Joseph, or tell us about Alexander the Great. people knew who was Alexander, right? So he's not coming and saying, well, I'm going to tell you a story that you never heard before. Okay, so it says, tell us about this person, because, meaning people knew about this, but tell us the Quranic version about it, or tell us in an Islamic way, or tell us the correct way. So again, the point is, people knew about these things. It wasn't knowledge that was only specific to him. We think that religions and cultures influence each other, and Islam is just like these other traditions, that it carries, baggage and influence from Jewish and Christian traditions, as well as other traditions.
To kind of, I guess the reason I feel like this question is kind of it's one of those I gotcha questions is because what we talked about earlier, how later there's a formulated idea about what the Quran is, how everything in it probably came from the mouth of God through Gabriel to Muhammad. So did God have to tell Gabriel this is the point I'm getting at. It's like, did God tell Gabriel to tell Muhammad that if you kill one man, it's like you killed all humanity? Well, that's found in the Jewish Talmud. Therefore, like, what makes more sense? And so I guess the person who asked the question would probably be like me, like, this is probably just culturally understood in the mind of Muhammad or the companions, whoever helped compile the documentation. But instead, you don't have to say that this stuff that we're finding out here really had to come down from heaven. I guess that's
I completely understand. I understand also the background and the backdrop of the question. But the issue is, yes, the Quran, again, just working within the Islamic narrative, they are not saying that the Quran was revealed that the Quran was revealed based on the revelation of Judaism and Christianity, right?
Right.
And I always say that even within the Islamic understanding, that Islam is the third of these religions. Okay, so yes, what was revealed in Christianity and what was revealed in Judaism, it's part of Islam. So if you find verses from the Jewish Talmud or from the Old Testament or New Testament that they are similar, yeah, I got you. This is plagiarism if you want, but Muhammad is telling them, I'm not getting this from God. This is not new revelation. It's revelation based on what was revealed before.
Okay.
You see?
Yep.
So that's the issue here. And of course, I understand if you are in the skeptical camp, you would say, oh, of course, this is verbatim the same verse. Of course, they must have translated it or plagiarized it. But again, the other side would say, well, okay, it's a kind of revelation, but sure, yeah, it exists in the Old Testament or in the Talmud or in the Bible, but that's a revelation that came before and it's now revealed again, but in Arabic. So which one you want? Which one is more sensical for you? You choose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hang Fashi, do you see evidence of modern scientific understandings modifying the various translations of the Quran into English? For example, where the sun sets or the concept of God expanding the heavens? A lot of people are saying there's Muslim miracles, scientific miracles or stuff like that.
Yes. So I can't think of something about scientific miracles, but definitely social issues. So, and this is very obvious in translation, especially in new translations. There are certain problematic issues in the Quran that they try to circumvent by rendering it in nicer English. And I think the example that I always teach in the class is the verse about the in the chapter of women about the beating verses. And if you see the different translation of the word beat, to beat someone, translators translate that differently. So some try to make it less of hitting, okay, and more less violent in a sense. And you have translators who try to put things in bracket, right? For example, if you consult Yusuf Ali's translation, he would say beat them, and then he put between parentheses only if it's the last resort. Okay, so getting this from jurisprudence is that you shouldn't do that right away, but you should do it as a last resort, getting this. So yes, there is interference from the translator and how they are translating the Quran based on their modern understandings. I can't get a example from scientific discoveries, but I wouldn't be surprised to find a new translation trying to put the Big Bang there, right, as a way of interpreting a verse, possibly. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve, is there evidence that Ali tampered with the Quran?
There's no historical evidence in the Muslim sources that Ali tampered the Quran. As I said, there is a Shi'i tradition that they believe that the Quran was tampered with. So this is a group within Shi'ism, early Shi'is, that they believe that there was tampering and falsification in the Quran. That Ali tampered the Quran both in the Sunni and Shia tradition, I'm not aware of any narrative to that regard. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. No more super chat questions, everybody. We're going to get the rest of these here as quick as I can. I don't want to keep Dr. Nasser here, too long. I want him to want to come back for future. Constellation Pegasus, where does Allah show up in history? Is he not a late invention after Christianity? I'm late to the show.
That's a long question. I think you would better ask someone like Hoyland or people who work with late antiquity about when exactly the word Allah comes up. I would recommend a book by Aziz Al-Azmi. It's called The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, Allah and His People. That's the book. It's 600 or 700 pages. It's very dense. I recommend this book to anyone who's really studying the emergence of Islam in late antiquity. This is the title of the book, and the different religious traditions and the formation of Islam at that period. I think I would go there. So it's a question related really more to historical investigation and Semitic philology, inscriptions. You would find a better answer with scholars who work with these issues directly.
Thank you. I have that book pulled up, adding it to my list here. Yeah. Appreciate that. Seth of Valhalla says, why should I believe that the book was compiled at a later date is actually a real unchanged, non-added to transmission of Muhammad?
You don't have to believe that. Again, I don't think this is it's a matter of belief. It's not a matter of really scientific evidence. So if someone is telling you that this is the same book that goes back to Muhammad, it's an article of faith. It's not really based on any research or scientific evidence. So we go back to the issue of trust. So Muslims trust their sources and they trust their people, and they have a reason to do that because it's a culture based on trust, especially with the transmission of things. As an outsider, I think you have all the right to not believe that this book goes back to Muhammad. And I think, as we discussed, there are many historical problems with tracing this book in its entirety from cover to cover to the early period. So you have all the right to be skeptical about this. I don't blame you for that.
That's why earlier I was asking, do you think there's sections that were after Muhammad was gone that maybe his companions put in? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's most probably, especially if you add all the different, again, just consulting Muslim sources, the ordering of the chapters, it was probably not done by Muhammad. The ordering of the verses, there's this agreement among scholars whether the verses were ordered by Muhammad or by the companions. There are many accounts about certain chapters missing certain verses. Like there's one chapter in the Quran, they said it's only 1/3 of it survived. So even within the Muslim tradition, there are accounts of within the Sunni tradition, I'm not saying the Shia tradition, that they are skeptical or they are trying to say, did we really receive everything?
Right.
Okay, so I think you and everyone should be wary of reading, and be skeptical, and it's very important to do that. Yeah.
But I feel like I want to speak on behalf of people who are like me who are skeptical. There's also the extreme the other way, and if you think Occam's razor,
mm-hmm.
when you put up hypotheses to try and explain this data, do you think they invented all of it, like completely made up all of what we're finding in what we're called the Quran? Like, to me, it seems like that's a little ad hoc, and it might be better to say there was something and it may have had some building onto it. We don't know. We have no way to prove, but why do we need it not to be? To me, it doesn't sound like every time you turn the page, he's walking on water, he's coming out of a grave, he's healing a leper. Like, it's not so fantastic to think that this would have gone back to Muhammad for me. And I'm a non-believer. So it's like,
again, I repeat that for a third or fourth time. It depends if you when there is information reported in Muslim sources from people coming from different political and theological perspective, and they are reporting more or less similar information, you start to have some kind of trust, in what they are saying, right? So when people say, well, the Quran was collected later on, and by Abdul Malik, let's say, or by late the Umayyads. I mean, you have to realize that the Umayyads were fighting everyone. So this is the caliphate that came after the 4 righteous caliphs, right? So the Umayyads were enemies with almost everyone. They were fighting people in Mecca. They sent a troop to Mecca. They destroyed the Kaaba. They rebuilt it again. They were fighting people in North Africa. They were expanding east and west. Everyone was against the Umayyads. And then suddenly the Umayyads come up with a narrative, and then everyone is happy with the narratives. I mean, that's not how people function. People are always resisting what the authoritative, if you want, regime impose on them. So if all these different factions, whether they are Sunnis or Shiites or Kharijites or Zaydis, they all agree that the Quran, and they have different traditions. They are not going to the same tradition. They say that the bulk of it really goes back to this early period. You start to have, as a critical scholar, you have to some kind trust these different trends, and that because they are conveying certain information that probably is true. So that's to it. Consider, you have to seriously consider their opinion rather than blindly trust them. So I think better is consider them and take them seriously, and not just completely ignore them just because they want to convey a certain ideological perspective.
Thank you. Inquisitive Mind, the ghost of MythVision. Can you tell us about the hereditary scribal errors between the 4 Uthmanic master copies and Michael Cook Hytham Sidki's stemma?
So this is a little bit technical. If you have a certain way, if you are spelling a certain word, and then let's say you have a manuscript and you are copying this manuscript and you are copying it with the same spelling, if you want, rules. So let's say in English, so you are the word neighbor with OU, and in British it would be, I don't know, OR, not OU. So you have different spelling, and then you are copying this manuscript, and then you are following the same spelling irregularities, or anomalies. So then you would say, well, basically all these manuscripts, even like they all have these spelling anomalies or scribal errors, even though that they know that it's an error, but they are following a prototype. So this is how you are basically going to a stemma or a parent manuscript by saying, well, all these, manuscript A and B and C, they all have the same mistakes, so they probably go to the same prototype. Because if one of these manuscripts, they are correcting the mistake, it means that they are most probably not following the prototype. But you are now sure they are copying it exactly, including the mistake. It means that it follows a certain prototype. So that's what, Michael Cook in his article, he tried to basically create a stemma which manuscripts or the different regional the readings or the manuscripts, they probably come from one parent manuscript, whether it's the Medina one or the Kufa one. I think he goes for the Kufa, that this is the parent manuscript. So this is how it's textual criticism, basically following the Western textual criticism, trying to map the manuscripts and take them to a parent manuscript.
Wow, that was Mouthful. Thank you. Steve's Sinead, why is Ezra only mentioned once in the Quran?
I don't know. We have to ask God about that. Yeah.
Steve, thank you for that super
Thank
chat.
you. But I mean, there are prophets mentioned 40 times or 50 times. Moses is, I think, the most mentioned in the Quran. I don't know how many times, but I think he's the most prophet mentioned in the Quran. Abraham is mentioned, I don't know, 60, 68, 69 times in the Quran. I can't tell you why this person was mentioned more than others. Moses, very important. So I would say that he's mentioned a lot because he's very important in the Islamic tradition as well. Jesus is very important. So this is why he was mentioned. Abraham, of course, is very important. Noah. So Ezra, why he's mentioned was once, maybe he's, of course, important, but not probably as important as the other biblical prophets, at least from the Islamic perspective. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. OG, thank you for the super chat. As an American, my preconceived notions may be inaccurate. Is it safe for you, Professor, to be able to teach these things?
I teach these things every semester, so that's not an issue. Some people are not happy with the content, not only in my courses, but I think in every course where you would have historical criticism, in a sense, that I'm sure that people would be uncomfortable with certain issues. I always teach these topics. Some people are happy, some people are not. I don't care. So
yeah, you're just doing your job.
Yeah.
And doing a good job. Inquisitive mind, can you tell us what was all of Ibn Mujahid's canonical grammatical mistakes? Can you give us all of the examples of what they were?
I can't give you now all the examples. I have them in my book. So my second book on Ibn Mujahid, I have, I think in the 4th chapter, this book. So I have a list of all the examples that he thought that they were mistakes. So from the canonical readings. And this is, again, the same position that I will reiterate now, is that Ibn Mujahid was an early scholar of qira'at, or readings. This was before orthodoxy, before all the 7 readings. Every single individual reading were considered to be divinely correct and without any grammatical mistakes. So Ibn Mujahid was one of those early scholars who did not hesitate from calling some readings to be mistakes, grammatical mistakes, or mistakes in transmission. There are a bunch of them. I listed them in the book. You can check them out right there. And he's not alone, Ibn Mujahid, in considering some of these canonical readings to be mistakes. Several other scholars like Zamakhshari, Tabari, Ibn Atiyah, all these scholars early, they considered many readings to be a mistake, grammatical mistakes. So,
in my question, if I can, just poking in there, maybe you have one example you can give. Are there any examples in your estimation that are mistakes that have become canonized in what we read today in the Quran, that like early on something happened where there's this mistake and it's become like official throughout the narrative all the way to today? Is there anything you can think of, or?
You mean from what I think is a mistake, or?
Right.
I mean, we don't have to go that far. I mean, even the list of mistakes that Ibn Mujahid lists,
right,
for him, they are considered mistakes, right?
Okay.
So, for example, in one account, he tells you not necessarily a mistake, but an unfavorable reading. So there is a sound in Arabic which is an emphatic sin. Okay, so it's a sa. Okay, it's an emphatic s. So in some recitation, you turn this sound, the sa, into close to the z sound. So instead of saying sa, you say z. Okay.
Okay.
So this za, emphatic z in Arabic, it doesn't exist as a letter. Okay. So you have 29 letters. This letter doesn't exist. So, for example, in one account, Ibn Mujahid says that I used to recite in this way with a certain word, that I used to say za with this emphatic scene. But then, because this is not a letter in Arabic, I abandoned this reading. Okay. So this, for example, one in his position that it is a canonical reading and people recite it today, but for him, he found this reading to be not favorable or ugly and aesthetically not appealing, and he abandoned this reading and he considered it to be incorrect or weak. Okay. And there are all the examples, like he would say, I used to recite this with my teacher and then I abandoned this reading, or this is a mistake. But after him, all these, what he called mistakes, they were not considered mistakes and they became part of the canon. And then Muslims recite them because all of the readings are considered to be canonical and correct. So there's not only one example, there are many, many other examples that in the early period, scholars considered to be mistakes, but then these mistakes became canonized and then people accepted them and then started reciting them.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Alan Bird says, was Muhammad literate, semi-literate, or illiterate?
Well, what does it mean to be illiterate in the 7th century? Can you read? If you are literate in the 7th century, you mean you read Arabic? Well, we had no Arabic books back then. So what do you read? You read commercial contracts, right? He was a merchant. Most probably he knew how to read and write. Was he able to read Hebrew and Syriac? I don't know. He commissioned some of his companions to read Syriac and Hebrew, right? And he told them to go learn them and tell them, the content of these books. So was he literate? Does it mean that literate he can read and write? Arabic was not a language that was widely written and read back then. There were no books. So you only use it for commercial usages, right? Contracts, if you are doing something with numbers and with really basic things, inscriptions on tombs, hymns. So that's about writing. Literate, if you mean literate, that was he knowledgeable of other cultures and what's in the books of Jews and Christians, most probably. He was very curious and he had conversations with rabbis, with priests. He traveled to Syria. He met with different people. So he definitely was literate in that regard, and he knew what was happening. He was not someone who was in a Bedouin living in Quraysh and not knowing what was happening around him.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. Big Boy, have you ever seen Farid Responds critique, and do you plan on responding to it? A critique of Shady Nasser's treatment of the Hadith of 7 Ahruf.
I don't like to engage in debates and refutations. People are free to criticize me, agree with me. So I don't mind the people disagreeing with me and criticizing my points of view. It's their own opinion. I respect different opinions, even if they disagree with me. So
my recommendation would be, if you're in communication with Farid, have him publish a peer-reviewed article and then see how it fares. We'll go from there. That would be my thing, because I'm with you. I don't like it's almost like it's just poop throwing. It's like, and I'm not into that. So Inquisitive Mind, how come Muslims don't know if the Basmala is verse number 1 or not of the opening chapter of the Quran if it is recited out loud 3 times a day?
The short answer is so the Basmala is the first opening verse in the name of God, the All Merciful, at the beginning of each chapter. And the reason why it was, there is disagreement whether it's part of the Quran or not, that it was not written in the early codices, right? And again, it's a good question that this is one of the problems. If you have a verse that people are reciting 3 times a day, 5 times a day, and more than 5 times, because you recite different chapters of the Quran during the prayer. So it's reciting it more than 3 times and more than 5 times. It goes now with the idea of written versus oral transmission. So in oral transmission, you have something, and then the written early codices, they have something else. And this is where the tension happens. So It's a good question. It's one of the problems that early Muslim scholars tried to tackle. and try to understand what does it mean. If we are really 100% sure that this is the Quran that goes back to the Prophet, why do Muslims disagree on this verse, whether it's part of the Quran or not? So there are, again, 4 different opinions on it. There's no disagreement. It's a good question. It's one of the if you want, problematic aspects in the transmission of the Quran that was and still is discussed widely in the sources.
Thank you so much. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. Those commentators that explain the crucifixion of Jesus, do we have dates when those commentaries were written?
No dates. It's same as the issue of hadith. So we have very early commentaries. You can date them again to the 8th century, but they are also, it's a chain of transmission that goes back to what the companions said. So again, it's not these testimonies about what happened to Jesus. It's going back directly to the Prophet or the companions of the Prophet. It's not eyewitnesses from what happened to. So you don't have a chain of transmission that goes back to what happened to Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where, of course, if you are
a church tries to claim somewhat.
What's that?
The church tries to kind of claim that the patristics were connected to.
No, but from the Muslim scholarship, at least.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You don't have chains of transmission that go back to they don't trust Christian sources in that regard, right? So as a Christian, you are not part of the chain of transmission, even if you say so. So you only have a chain of transmission that goes back to Muhammad. You don't have anything before that. So the issue is, if you are a scholar of the Bible, of course, you are not going to trust the Muslim sources about that, because they are only telling you things that go back to the time of Muhammad and maybe before, with pre-Islamic history, etc. So again, all these sources, they date back to the 8th century, early 8th century, and they go in a chain of transmission of narrators that you either have to trust or be critical of.
Thank you. Inquisitive Mind, does Ibn Shanabuth's lashing example prove that the Uthmanic codices were forced on the people using violence?
The Uthmanic codices were enforced using political influence and power, and yes, sometimes violence, if you want to call it violence in that sense. So Ibn Shanabuth was one of those Qur'an readers who were reciting the Qur'an in not the standard Uthmanic Qur'an. So he was tried and imprisoned, he was tortured, and most probably executed, or he got out of prison and died because of his wounds. So, and this is 9th century. So this is 300 years after Uthman, right? And we have several examples also from before that people were reciting in non-canonical readings and people were rebuking them. You have committees, a kind of committees, and people going around and seeing what people were reciting, making sure that they are reciting the Uthmanic or the standard canonized version. You had people who were going around checking the codices, right, and making sure that they agree with the copies. If not, they were fixing them or correcting them. And all these, they are in the sources. Okay, so you can consult them. So yes, the Uthmanic codices were enforced. It's a political decision, and they were enforced. And people, if you don't disagree, if you disagree with the Uthmanic version, there are ramifications, and you are tried and severely punished.
Thank you. Last one, Bobby, California. To the point about needing to consider extra Quranic tradition sources, hadith, and other sources, say Dhul-Qarnayn, were others besides Alexander, a contemporary of Abraham, for example? What says Shadi?
Non-Quranic traditional sources about Dhul-Qarnayn.
Extra Quranic.
So I mean, there's the I think the scholarly understanding of Alexander is that it goes back to the Romans of Alexander, right? So the story of Alexander the Great or Dhul-Qarnayn, it goes back to the Alexander Romans, and as far as
Tommaso Tessai's work on that.
So and Kevin van Bladel, also at Yale, he has a long article on that, on he's studying this the story of Alexander the Great from Syriac sources as well, and the Alexander Romans. So my understanding is that this is the Alexander legend, if you want. It goes back to that period, and this is extra Quranic non-commentary material. And scholars do say that it goes back to Alexander the Great legend or romance.
Thank you. Absolutely amazing. This has been a wonderful stream. I hope that you'll get Shady's work, Dr. Nasser's work. I always appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me here. Don't go anywhere yet, if you don't mind, just to get you a minute after we close out here. Look, hit the like button. Share this out with a friend. Let's show love and community, and just try to be the best humans we can today. I love learning all sorts of stuff. I hope that you learned a lot today, and I hope to continue learning in this vein. So any final words from you, Dr. Nasser?
No, thank you very much. And thank you for all the questions. And hopefully this was useful for some. And again, thank you for having me again.
Thank you. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. All right.